All right, so let's just start out. I just call this the neurotheology of grief. And all I mean by that is neuro, meaning mind, the neurology, and theology, what God says about grief. So how do our brains, our bodies, our personalities, our dispositions, how do pneumonia still has a little grip on me, so I apologize for any coughing that's going to occur, and some is, I'm sure. But just to talk about grief through the filter of theology and the brain is kind of the aim for today. That's the reason for that title, and coaching and guiding grieving people, which, as we said what I said a few minutes ago, that's everyone we coach. Everyone we coach on some level is going to need to be you and he or she to be dipping into the well of grief. So Oh yeah, that's a spoiler alert. Everyone you work with is grieving. So I'm taking this first section. I'm going to read some sections to you out of this book by Mary Frances O'Connor. She is a neuropsych professor at University of Arizona. It's really a great read. There are others. David Kessler has written a ton on grieving. He was worked alongside the famous Elizabeth Kubler-Ross as she developed the stages of grief. Kessler's a good resource, but this book here is really good to kind of combine the neuro part of what we would understand to be neurotheology, the theology of grieving. So this first part, I'm going to be borrowing from Mary Frances O'Connor. So she creates a metaphor. I gave the people in the story workshop this past weekend a little preview of this. She gave this metaphor. She said, imagine that you are in your home at night and your house is pitch black. And you're getting up to get a drink of water. Well, what's happening there is your brain, kind of with this image here, your brain creates a map, and the brain creates a map of the external world where we don't have to rely fully on the external world to navigate. It's internal experience. And she gives an example. If you're getting up and getting a drink of water, my house is kind of laid out this way, actually. If you walk through the dining room, you would be used to your hip hitting that dining room table, brushing against the dining room table, and that would orient you to where you were in the house. And so she says that way we kind of live in two different worlds. I'm going to read you taking from her first chapter of her book. She says, your brain is moving your human form through the virtual map it has created. So your brain's got a map. It maps nouns. We'll see that in just a minute. It maps people, places, and things in your world. It provides a limbic map of those. It's moving your human form through the virtual map it has created, which is why you can move through your house fairly easily in the dark, because you're not using your external world to navigate. You're using your brain map to get around this familiar space with your human body arriving where your brain has sent it. So the point there is that our brains will embed in it a map of your world, the metaphor being walking through your house in the dark. And so she says, we rely on our brain maps because walking your body through your mental map of the world takes a lot less computing power than walking through your familiar house as though it were your first experience. So think about the first night you live in your house, if you walk through your house in the pitch black, as opposed to after you've lived there for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, a whole different experience. As though you were discovering each time where the doorways and walls and furniture are and deciding how to navigate. I've talked often, how the brain is efficient and it doesn't want to make decisions if it doesn't have to. And I've used the example this weekend of driving to our church. After 12 years of being in one building, we moved to a permanent building. And I went to the wrong location, the old location, 2 weeks in a row because my brain was not doing turn by turn. It was just going to church. And so the brain works on efficiency, but when we're first walking through a dark house, we first moved in, we're having to pay really close attention to where things are. Whereas when our brain has mapped the house, we don't have to do that anymore. So she gives this idea that if you're walking through your home and you're used to your hip brushing up against the table, but you're walking and your brain remembers it's about this point that I brush against the table. So I know to kind of make a slight left to go into the kitchen, but your hip doesn't touch the table. The table's not there. And it's as if we don't have a category for going to bed at night and our dining room table being there and getting up at 3 a.m. to get a drink of water and the table's not there anymore. So she says, no one expects their dining room table to get stolen, and no one expects a loved one to die. Now, we know cognitively that everyone dies, but our limbic systems are not prepared for people to die. And I would say not just people, but dreams, desires, locations, like not, we'll talk about this in just a minute, people, places, and things. So I'll read that again with this way. No one expects their dining room table to get stolen, and no one expects their loved ones or their special places or their dreams or their visions or hopes to die. Even when a person has been ill for a very long time, no one knows what it will be like to walk through the world without this other person. I would say without this other thing, without this dream, without this vision, without this experience. And I remember, this is not graphic, but it's I guess maybe was powerful for me. I was at my dad's bedside when he passed away. And I remember it was, what we would call expected. He had pancreatic cancer and, clearly was terminal. But I remember standing there the moments after he died, had this rush of fear come over me. I was 43 years old. So cognitively, I had a family of my own. And I was 43 years old. I knew my dad was going to die. But when that actually happened, it occurred to me instantly, within seconds, that I have never been on earth without this man being on earth with me. And it was scary to me. And so I didn't know what it was like to walk through the world without him until that moment. And that's played out the last several years. So O'Connor goes on to say, grief is a heart-wrenchingly painful problem for the brain to solve. Now think about that. Your brain is in your head. God has made it such that it's there to solve problems for protection and connection. Remember that, what the brain does. A heart-wrenchingly painful problem for the brain to solve, and grieving necessitates learning to live in the world with the absence of someone, or I would say something you love deeply. And listen to this, who is ingrained in your understanding of the world. Now, we need to pay attention to that as coaches. The people we deal with, I'll read her sentence again, they're going to be dealing with on some level of something that was ingrained in their understanding of the world. We're going to talk about this as we wrap up today. A ritual around alcohol, a ritual around pornography, a ritual around defeating their partner in arguments, for instance. The loss of the place you grew up in because a parent moved. We talked about that some this past weekend, about moving. And so our internal Google Maps, it maps things, but those things that are mapped in our limbic systems, they become ingrained in our understanding of the world. So she says, this means that for the brain, your loved one, or I would say your place, your dream, your vision, your thing, your person, your loved one is simultaneously gone and also everlasting. Like where I grew up before all the moves started in suburban Atlanta. Even when I go back, it's changed on the surface, but when I go back to Marietta, Georgia, my brain remembers what it used to look like and what my experiences there were. So it's been ingrained, but it's gone. I haven't lived there forever. But it's also everlasting. My memories of that place are everlasting. And when I go back to Cobb County, Georgia, those two worlds come together. The fact I haven't lived there in a long time, it looks really different than it did, and yet it still lives in my brain. That's what happens when someone dies, or a dream dies, or a vision dies, or a hope dies. She says, you're navigating your life despite the fact that they have been stolen from you, a premise that makes no sense and that is both confusing and upsetting, like your dining room table being stolen. So that's kind of sets the groundwork. It's the last thing I'll be reading to you. That kind of sets the groundwork for the conversation. We just remember with this slide here, look at how the different parts of the brain are lit up. Grieving is a total brain experience. And so our people that we coach are going to be dealing with grief in this universal experience. And they're going to be grieving things that have become ingrained in their understanding of the world and in their understanding of their place in the world. So when we're talking to people, it's going to be really important that we keep in mind how that works. That's preview coming tracks, not time for that yet. So let's move it into the relational world. So we know the brain creates a map, and the map has people, places, and things and experiences and dreams and visions and hopes, longings in it, all of which are affected when we suffer loss, this universal experience. So if you take a look at when you fall in love with someone or something, one of your babies is born, your spouse, a town, an area, a mountain range, a hope, a vocation. So when you fall in love with something or someone, the brain encodes that as a bond. You are bonded to that. And like, it's sometimes talked about, a lot of times it's talked about with men. A man, it doesn't take very long. If you ask a question about a man's life, he'll say, well, I'm a therapist, or I'm a pastor, or I'm a whatever. But some of that is just brain encoding that the things that are important to us, the people, places, and things that are important to us become part of that bond. And so it creates a we. When you follow a team, a lot of times people will say, well, we won this week, and they're talking about the Titans or whoever. So it creates a we, not just a you and me. It's biblically Genesis 2:24. People get married. There's a Joe and there's a Jane, and they get married. Well, they're still separate people, but they form one thing. So that's what the brain does. The brain joins things and makes it one. And so, for instance, this is even in our language. We don't say, well, we went to the mountains, and then the first day we went to Cades Cove, and then we went here, and then we went here, and then we went there. We'll normally say, I went on vacation. One word to describe a week's worth of experience, individual experiences. And so that's what the brain does to bond things. So there's a we that includes like an overlapping experience. So your marriage, a business partnership, people that you're in church with, your experience with different places that you live, a job that you love, a calling that you're under, that creates this we in the brain that becomes part of me, we say. And so when a loved one or a dream or a vision or a hope isn't there anymore, we literally experience that part of me is missing. Now, there's one writer that I love to read on neuroscience. He says at a very neural level, our representation of the we has a hole in it. In other words, when we lose a dream, a vision, a hope, a longing, a person, a job, something like that, it creates a hole in that what used to be we, and that hole is limbic. So that brings to part in discussion where when we're talking about grief, we are necessarily going to be talking about other feelings. And very often the primary one underneath the grief will be hurt. Even that wording that Casalino says here about neural coding and the we has a hole in it, something that has a hole in it, it would hurt to make the whole. And so very often underneath people that are grieving the loss of a person, a place, or a thing are going to have a tremendous level of hurt because the disconnection hurts. And we've talked, when we teach hurt, we teach that, hey, the word even means, squeezing and stabbing and piercing. And so, and our language describes, hurt in physical terms, a slap in the face, a punch in the gut, those kinds of things. And so we need to include certainly hurt, or at least be checking that out with clients. It's like, in your sadness, in your lament, as we're talking about this, what else do you feel coming up in you? Some will say anger, some will say hurt, many will say lonely. All the feelings count, but be listening for hurt, because in so many ways, hurt is the one that people will be repelled to not talk about first, because it is so physiologically bonded. Like, we don't want to touch a stove again when it's hot, for instance. That's our brain taking care of us through protection. And so a lot of times people will not want to talk about being hurt with God or angry with him or being hurt by someone else. When I was a pastor, our church had a pretty good number of senior adults, and so lots of funerals. And some of those funerals, the person had died because he or she, for instance, had been a really heavy smoker. And sometimes the spouse, the longer we talked about the loss itself, they would begin to talk about, well, I told him for years, or I told her for years to stop smoking or to stop eating like that. He was going to get diabetes or whatever it may be. So oftentimes underneath the grief and the sadness, we need to expand the camera to say, let's talk about other feelings too. And I know we do that, but I would say let the sadness be your anchor point with someone you're coaching, and move out from that to hurt. We're going to see that in just a minute with an example from scripture of grief. We at my church, it was just kind of a nondescript day. A day like today, we were in Fort Worth, and a couple friend, they actually were friends of mine, and Sheila's in the church, and I was their pastor. The husband called. He said, her first name is Kathy. He said, Kathy and I want to come by and see you. We've had something happen. I said, well, of course, come on by. So they came by. What had happened is Kathy's brother, who had a family of his own, he loved really, really fast motorcycles, and he was very dangerous with the motorcycle. And he had been blazing down a semi kind of country road-ish, kind of an old highway. They're called farm to market roads in Texas, an FM road. He was blazing down there, and a truck pulled out in front of him. He was killed on impact. It just happened that morning. And so this couple sitting in my office, and Kathy said to me, she goes, I know I'm sad, but right now I am so angry at my brother in his, I think he was in his 40s, out there riding that motorcycle that way. She goes, is it okay if I'm hurt, offended, and angry at him before I can be sad? And I told her, like, what a really insightful, truthful question. The answer is absolutely. So sometimes we will know that the core of what's going on is the grief, but there are a lot of other feelings sitting on top of that. So that's, I know you know that, just kind of a reminder that having grief as an anchor point, and we'll talk about some specific situations in a little bit, having grief as an anchor point, they're going to want to meander all over the place as they're dealing with their lament of that grief. So there's a place in scripture, 1 Samuel 1:26. I think it's actually 2 Samuel. I messed that up. 1:26. David is lamenting Jonathan's death. You know, Saul and his dad, Saul and his son Jonathan, David's best friend, have been run through in warfare. And the ESV, David is lamenting, expressing, says, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant you have been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. And I'm not making a joke here. If you know the life of David, the man loved women. And so he was saying something, and he was also speaking to the natural inclination of that. And so then the NIV says, I grieve for you, kind of the more readable version. Jonathan, my brother, you were very near to me. Your love is wonderful than that of women. And I just went to the lexicon, handy dandy lexicon, and here's what the word grieve and distress means. It means adversary, or to cramp, to bring distress, to shut in, to besiege, and to be bound. Listen to how violent the wording is. And that gives us a hint also to how hurt plays into grief so often. So the ESV, distressed, the NIV, grieve. Those are powerful words if you look underneath just the English syntax or English definitions of them. They are powerful. David is saying, Jonathan, your death, it's an adversary, it's an affliction to me. I'm distressed, I'm oppressed, I'm shut in, I'm besieged. I'm bound up like a straitjacket. And so David's using very illustrative language to say, when I found out about your death, it was so devastating to me. It was like all these things, someone was wrapping me up in a straitjacket. I was being attacked. I was being afflicted. I was being wounded. There's that hurt. So it's very important that we pay very close attention to when people are grieving. We know that internally, they may not recognize it, but internally, these words are true for them too. That whatever they're grieving, a person, a place, a thing, what they're grieving, it is besieging them, it is attacking them, it is binding them up like a straitjacket. And so that's where we begin to think in these biblical terms. We think about Jesus's response in John chapter 11. Jeff and I wrote about that in the Bible study, in the sadness chapter. He said that, Jesus breathed out this noise that was like a horse snorting. And Jesus, in the grief he was feeling and the other feelings he was feeling about all that was going on, he just exhaled this guttural sound. And I'm reminded of that when I read this about David's response to Jonathan's death. And so just remember that when our clients have suffered loss, and we know they have, and the inside of their recovery process, there's going to be this deep well or a well of grief. Limbically speaking, they're undergoing what David is saying here, what Jesus expressed in John 11 with Mary and Martha and the other people there. And so grief has in it a violence to the soul that says this ought not be. We had a we, there's a hole in the we, and I can't stand it because now my map is completely interrupted and my GPS is off kilter. I don't even know where I'm going now. So there's this study, I think it's fascinating. They studied voles at University of Colorado Boulder. They studied voles, and voles are like little prairie dogs, kind of like chipmunk, prairie dog, ground squirrel combination, funny looking little animal. And they studied them. The thing about voles is they mate for life. They are completely monogamous. And so in the animal kingdom, they choose a mate, and that's their mate. And then, like kind of like penguins and what humans are designed to do. And so they started noticing that proteins in the brain were affected by this. And in the nucleus accumbens, that's this little pointing to right here. Nucleus accumbens, remember, the nucleus accumbens is what becomes very, very active in the reward pathway, or dopamine. And it's designed to just spritz the pleasure hormone, the pleasure neurotransmitter through the brain. We wake up and enjoy coffee. We're doing our quiet time. We see the sunrise. We talk to a friend, we see our spouse, and those are things just to spritz dopamine throughout the day. And then we know that addiction opens up the valve and dopamine just floods the brain, and the brain says, oh, I love that, give me more. And that the VTA, that's the storehouse of the dopamine. The nucleus accumbens with pleasure says, hey, let go of some dopamine, put dopamine through the system. And the VTA says, okay. And so this is the warehouse of the dopamine and the distributor. And this is the headquarters. Headquarters calls the warehouse and says, hey, let go of some dopamine. And the VTA says, okay, gotcha, boss. And just start spreading that out there. So what happens is when we bond in a relationship, again, with we were talking about Sheila earlier, she loves the Rocky Mountains. I love the Smoky Mountains. And so when we go to the Smokies, something happens in that dopamine with me that doesn't happen in the Rockies. And when we go out to where Sheila's from, the New Mexico Rocky Mountains, that happens in her brain more than it does in mine. Back to childhood experiences. And so we were both kind of mountain vacation families, and they went to the Rockies and we went to the Smokies. But so when we're together doing that, our nucleus accumbens is sending dopamine in different levels to both of us, depending on where we are. And so there are these neurons that happen that when I approach her or the Smokies or something pleasurable, or Todd sitting across a room from me, people that I love, things that I love, when I do that, those neurons that are devoted to that dopamine, they become very active. And so I'm used to a dopamine surge when I'm with Sheila, when I'm in the mountains, when I'm with Todd, when I'm with you, all of you, like that's what's supposed to happen. So what happens though, that bond grows deeper and deeper and deeper. The dopamine gets more and more active. The reward system gets more and more activated. And so it kind of gives an idea of, think about how important bonding is to the human being, how bonding it is. And that's what we call attachment. And so when we're with people and our longings we're seeing our longings move toward fulfillment, our desires being fulfilled, dopamine through our system, well, that creates attachment. That's what attachment's made of. Kirk Thompson calls it the 4 S's: seen, safe, soothe, and secure. And so we have this very active nucleus accumbens running dopamine through the system based on the bond of the we. So grief occurs, the bond is broken, the hole gets in the we, and all of a sudden we're searching for that dopamine that we used to have when we're with them. So they notice these things happening in the brains of these voles, and we'll read you part of that research. So they had these voles together and they separated them. They separated the mates. Upon separation, physiological changes happen. Stress hormones like cortisol were released. And so they're separated from their mate. They're separated from that thing they're bonded with. They're separated from that we that they had established. And so we saw physiological changes that happen. Stress hormones that increase like cortisol, and we see dopamine and oxytocin really trying to motivate us to find them again. That's very, very, very important. The brain is very active. When we lose something of value, someone of value, our brain works really hard to find them again. That's part of the draw. My left brain knows that my mom and dad are in heaven. They're not in a cemetery in Moore, Oklahoma. But once in a while, I'll want to go by there. Obviously, if we're out there a long ways away, and just look at the grave markers, because my brain is searching for them still. My brain is searching for losses that I've had. And so they notice this in these voles, our brain activity started attempting to produce the dopamine and the oxytocin, looking to get the bond back. And so when the bond doesn't occur again, that's where we call waves of grief. And so even to explain that to people that are grieving deeply, and we're going to look at some examples here in the next few slides, even when we're doing that, and they have these recollections of broken connections, you can just let them know, like, hey, your brain is busily attempting to find what you've lost. That's what brains do. I love dopamine. I love attachment. I love bonding. And there's been a hole put in the we, and my brain, my GPS is searching to get the bond reestablished. And so just to let them know, like, when you have a wave of grief, that's very, very normal. Like, that's how God made your bodies, how God made your brains, how God made your limbic system to really attach deeply, back to the link between sadness and attachment. So these voles were really distressed. So here's University of Colorado researcher said, and over time then, there are neural and transcription changes that happen in the brain as the voles try to understand what has happened. So neural means neurons. The neurons run by the neurotransmitters change, and the transcription, how it is coded, C-O-D-E-D, how it's coded in the brain begins to change. You all know the story. I'll be brief. The 2 months after my dad passed away, Luke hit his first home run. And when he hit it, I was coaching in summer league, and I was walking back to the first base coaching box, and I reached into my pocket. It was super informal in the summer. Reached into my pocket to call my dad to tell him that Luke had hit his first home run. And it occurred to me as the phone was going to my ear, like, he's not here. And so I was having to, the transcription hadn't occurred fully yet. My instinct was to reach in my pocket, call Dad. Hey, Dad, Luke just hit his first one. It was great. But then the transcription began to change. When other great things happened because the transcription had changed and neurons had fired differently, I didn't reach in my pocket to call my dad because I knew it had been coded differently, like, oh, he's not here. He's in heaven. So they went on to say, I think we're seeing how the brain has to update and change, and that's partly a mechanical process, and all of that takes time. So then we remember that their brains are changing, whatever it is they're grieving. Again, from here, we move quickly to the next slides as just examples and sort of kind of case studies of how this plays out practically in our coaching. So their brains are changing due to neural changes, and they're having to transcribe new material. And so that takes time to do that. We call it limbic revision. And so as the brain is revised for the GPS to accommodate different terrain, that's what we're walking them through. Last thing before we move through the rest of the slides pretty quickly. The American Heart Association did their own research on grief. Here's what they said. Grief can reinforce brain wiring that effectively locks the brain in a permanent stress response. Now, if they're not talking to a 10-man coach or someone that loves them or their pastor or a therapist or a friend, if they're not talking to anyone about their grief, their brains will be locked in a permanent stress response. And we know what that does to the entire body. So to promote healthy rewiring, American Heart Association, people need to strengthen the parts of the brain that regulate the response. This involves a whole range of creative and contemplative practices, from painting to meditation to expressions of faith with other people. And so bringing that language over from the left brain into the right brain, where that limbic system story is told, the brain gets through limbic revision because the brain's really busy looking for that bond that was broken. Me calling my dad 2 months after he had died, I was looking for that connection with him. and I had forgotten, quote unquote, because the transcription hadn't finished being written in my brain yet. I'd forgotten he was gone from the earth. So last thing from them, they say, by writing about disturbing memories or troubling dreams, you can, quote, read it over in your own words and annotate it over time. Last sentence, that is the way you start to rebuild more positive neural connections. That's what we call healing. American Heart Association calls it rebuilding more positive neural connections. We call it limit revision and healing of the sadness, of the grief. So we'll move into, so this is just a little brief, won't stay very long, a little brief take, three major parts of the brain: prefrontal cortex, where we think, it's underactive. I'm walking to the first base coach's box. I'm not thinking that he's gone. Anterior cingulate cortex, that's the part of the brain that is the liaison between thinking and feeling, gives words to it. It's underactive. I can't give words. The amygdala is overactive. So people are in a stress response. So when we're walking them through these days, these times, we're walking them through that. We are addressing the amygdala so the PFC and the ACC, number 1 and 2, can get back online. So we're dealing with people that are in the throes of grief. That's what we're dealing with. So we'll run through these quickly for time. At least we got a couple of minutes left. So we talked about this a little bit in the story workshop this weekend too. In our teaching and a lot of our work, we do a lot of work on feelings and needs. And we often won't think a whole lot about desire and longings because they're harder to nail down. But these are 5 longings. A longing is just a spiritual expression of desire. Like, we deep within our souls, God's wiring of us, we want to live in a just world. We want to have rest where I can rest with both eyes closed. An alarm clock's not going to go off. A baby's not going to cry. The house isn't going to creak and pop. Like, I'm just going to rest with complete rest. And then safety, someone looking out for my welfare. Peace, to cease striving. I don't have to strive anymore. It's not such hard work. And then the longing for home. And we talked about that this weekend, that story is story of home, my longing for home, the home I had and the home I'm looking for, and the in-between. So sometimes it will help, and people will say, it's not fair. It's not fair. That's about justice. And they will literally say, I can't rest. I can't sleep. I can't. That's their longing for perfect rest. And it's like, the world doesn't feel safe anymore. I remember the death of my grandfather. I remember telling my cousin, he and I are both very close to we called him Granddaddy, kind of Mississippi story. My granddaddy, and I told him, when I was talking to him on the phone, I said, it's so weird. The world doesn't feel as safe as it did when Granddaddy was here. So people taking comfort in people that were important to them. And then that longing for home is like, E.T., phone home. I want to go home. And we know that's all caps, home to be with Christ. But we have homes here on earth too. And so when home gets lost on earth, it triggers that longing for ultimate home with him, and ultimate rest in him, and ultimate peace and safety with him, and perfect justice when Jesus makes all things right. When he comes with justice, Isaiah says he comes with recompense. We know a day is coming when that's going to happen. So grief and longings are really connected together. So we talked about this at length. We won't say much about it, but it's important to remember, especially in the recovery process, that we grieve nouns. We grieve people for sure. We know that, people that we love, but we also grieve loss of place. Very, very often we'll go back to our hometowns and go, man, it's just so different. More traffic and convenience stores where there used to be woods, and gosh, the house I grew up in is in disrepair, or things like that. Or man, I really long for people that move here from the desert, Arizona. They'll long for those desert scenes, and vice versa. People from the southeast or the east will move out west. That was me. I moved to West Texas. Like, man, I miss Georgia hills and pine trees. And so we miss places, and then things like visions and dreams and hopes and longings. So just remember that even if it's not the death of a person, people grieve things more than just people. They grieve loss of place and loss of things, even intangible things like hopes. So here are some of the forms. These are just examples. You guys have walked through this. For example, a young lady may call one of our female coaches. Jordan may place a young lady who's lost a baby. And so obviously a person died, but then there's a physical space. Like most of us on here are parents, and we, even before we started working on the nursery, literally, we were thinking about the nursery, thinking about where the baby will sleep, and thinking about the toddler walking through the house. And it was fun. You know, she and I married 7 years before our son Luke was born, and it was kind of fun to even kind of baby proof the house, you know, as he was going to learn to walk and stuff. So we will grieve, with example, with a miscarriage, all, and then the things, dreams, visions, hopes, possibilities, what I hoped for this baby to have and to experience, what I hope to experience with this baby. So very often we will need to make sure in this little case study example, that we're being very comprehensive around what all is involved in the grief and the other feelings beyond a person. Examples, people don't respond like I had hoped, and like, you know, for instance, staying with the miscarriage idea, like, man, people, and I've had this, and you may have too. I've had people, ladies say to me, like, people say things like, well, at least it wasn't born yet. It wasn't born yet. Really insensitive, hurtful things like that. And so that creates more grief. Like, I thought, I had hoped I would have more support. I would hope people would be more accepting of how in the throes of grief I am. And then people with that's person in place. I thought we went through this when we moved here. We loved living in Dallas, Fort Worth, and we thought, I moved all my whole life. Sheila never moved in her life. She was born and raised in the same place for generations. But I really thought Fort Worth, Texas would be our roots. And when we moved here, like topographically in the mountains and nearby and the green, people go, what in the world? Sheila even mentioned to me one time, she said, honey, what is it you miss about Fort Worth? Is it the traffic, like the heat, crime? What exactly are you missing? I said, well, I miss the place. I miss living there. I thought we would be rooted there forever and not move. And then often people there, I just use this ministry example, this thing, this church plant, this ministry, this hope, it's not what I envisioned. I thought we would grow. I thought people would be more excited. I thought this initiative would happen, and it didn't. So those are just examples of some how grief makes its way through loss of people, places, and things. And this is important here too. We'll run through these. When we're talking about people who are in addiction, classic addiction like drugs, sex, alcohol, and people who are in an addictive relationship with people pleasing, codependency, rituals are so important in addictive cycles. Like, people go through the ritual of how they're going to drink, the ritual of how they're going to act out sexually, the ritual of how they please different people who are, and this is part of my recovery, I was attempting this chameleon-like existence. Well, I had rituals with every person or every group I went through. I had to do the certain things in a certain way so they didn't have feelings, so I didn't get abandoned. And so we also create relationships and bonding with our drug of choice. Like, people have a relationship with alcohol. They have a relationship with pornography. They have a relationship with drugs. And so part of the grief process in addiction is grieving the loss of the bonding I had made with my drug of choice. The loss of, I start telling the truth to people. I start setting boundaries. I deal with my codependency, my people-pleasing addiction. And I've got this relationship with security and safety. Now, it's counterfeit, but I have to deal with, I told someone no, or I told someone the truth, and I lost the security that codependency provided for me. And to help people literally grieve the loss of power codependency appears to give us. And then loss of freedom. I've talked to maybe thousands, hundreds for sure, of addicts who talk about, I could really be myself when I was drinking, could really be myself when I was acting out. I could be myself when I finally got those pills in me. So we know it's counterfeit. We know relationships are counterfeit and freedom is counterfeit in addiction, but limbically they feel real. And so helping people in classic addiction, helping people in codependency, people pleasing, mourn the loss of the rituals they used to count on to remain safe, mourn the loss of the relationship of power their addiction gave them, and mourn the loss of the freedom when they got lost in their addiction, the freedom they experienced, though counterfeit. It's a real live way of a real live grief process through different recovery types of recovery. So last thing, just coaching points for us. Last slide. Comfort, we know that, to fortify people being present with them, and then to connect. So connect you to them. We connect the client to the loss, even the under the radar losses, like we just talked about, the loss of ritual, the loss of freedom, loss of relationship. Connect you with the client, connect the client to the loss and the depth of the loss, and then let the client know that you two are connected to the loss. Like if I'm dealing with a pastor who is grieving the loss of what he thought his church would be, and I can come to him and not throw my story on him, but say, yeah, I really thought that when our church began to heal in Texas, that it would feel really different, and that everyone's attitude would be of gratitude, and we're up and running again, and God's moving again. But it didn't turn out that. There are a lot of people who, turns out, they were loving all the chaos, and they continued to try to create chaos. And so to be able to tell a coach that, or someone we're coaching, that, like, I get it. I get lost in my own experience. And then we co-labor with them. We can tend to think that Psalm 23 is like 3 chapters. The first chapter is still waters and green grass and the shepherd walking with me, and it's kind and sweet and bucolic and tender. And then there's a second chapter. We're walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Like, man, let's hurry through this part. And then the third chapter is, man, he pursues me ardently. Goodness and mercy follow me in the days of my life. I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Man, thank goodness we got there. But what if we looked at Psalm 23 as just one chapter with 3 movements? And this is how life works. We do know we have the good shepherd. He does lead us to still waters and green grass. And as the camera pans out, we also walk through valleys of the shadow of death we may not even recognize we're walking in. But the camera angle goes out, we go, oh, this isn't another chapter. This is how life works. Like, grief is universal and ubiquitous. And so I'm walking through, this is not a chapter, this is life. This is no different than the still waters. It just feels sad and hurtful and those other things. And then walking into the next movement of life, to where I can recognize and have gratitude for God's faithfulness, and he is going to pursue me ardently, which is what follow me means. And so we can help our clients see that loss is so much embedded in the human experience, that even in Psalm 23, it's not chapter after chapter. It's just one chapter called life, and it's got grief all the way through it. So we're constantly in the valley of shadow of death, remembering and hoping for the green grass and the still waters to be restored, and recognizing that there's a day coming when I dwell in the house of the Lord forever. But in between those two, we're going to have grief experiences, and those are normal. So to help normalize that experience with people that we're coaching is also super helpful. So that's just kind of some three Baptist points to start with C for you at the end of this. So let's stop the share. There we are. So we've got about 10 minutes or so. We kind of ran through that pretty quickly, but questions, clarifications, anything come up for anybody?
Phil, can you talk about sometimes when the grief isn't even understood, like for like a child, a small child in a divorce and dad's gone, or and the child's not necessarily even knows what he's grieving, but his brain is still looking for that hole that just was created in the we. And then what happens in that situation, and a lot of times how that'll lead to addictive type compensation. But can you talk about how it happens that way? And then we're dealing with the grown-up version of that child that happened to.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about the grown-up version. Yeah, that's important, because that's going to be a lot of times exactly who we're talking about. You know, if there's a 10-man Tim and a 10-man Tess, that's who we're coaching. A lot of those things.
Yes.
So sometimes it's super important to do exactly what you just did, Jeff. Like, let me tell you how the brain works, and the brain is going to find something to fill the hole, right? Like if a regular hole in the yard, I'm fill it with concrete, fill it with dirt, fill it with filler, like whatever. I'm gonna fill it with something. And so to help that person see the connection between the break in we, and the old phrase, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, we abhors a hole. Let's go and fill it with something. I have a very, very close friend who walked in. He's a food, to this day, is a food addict, overeating addict. He binges and no purging. He's morbidly obese. And he tells a story of walking into the house, and his mother and his sister were going at it again, as he said. He said, I turned around. I went to the grocery store. I bought several bags of chips and sweets and a couple of liters of Coke. I went out to the lake. That's the first time I felt okay about living in my house. And so this guy in particular had filled that hole with food, and will fill that hole with sexual expression. And this is a good time to take people also back to the 4 places in the body that the body is stimulated. Some people will fill that hole with intellectualism or learning, stimulating the brain. Some will do it like my friend. Some will do it with food to stimulate the belly. Some will do it with the disordered eating and anorexia, bulimia. They'll restrict their eating to stimulate their stomach. And then sexual expression, stimulation of genitalia. They'll do that. And then skin stimulation, high-risk behavior, gambling. I recently talked to a man who he doesn't go to Vegas. He doesn't bet on football or games or baseball games. He takes high-risk investments, and he was sitting right there 2 weeks ago, and he was over $2 million in debt. His wife had just found out, and been years and years and years. He's stimulating his skin. He's borrowing money, and as they say, robbing Peter to pay Paul, but he's filling that hole. And so to take them back to that story, which is our job, connecting feelings with story, take him back to that boy, which is what I'm doing with him, or that girl, take them back to where the hole occurred. And let's talk about what you've put in the hole and what it has done to restore you to your freedom and your relationship, and et cetera. So going back to those points, to help them grieve the rituals they've established, the freedom they had, and the relationship they formed with whatever they put in the hole that was counterfeit. And we do that with, for you guys know this, but when we do that without judgment, when we do that with care, firmness, setting boundaries, kindness and lack of judgment doesn't mean we don't set boundaries and point out destructive stuff or sin. Doesn't mean that, but it means that the tone of the room, we call it limbic resonance, even when we're confronting things, the tone of the room is care. And we know this, I say even coaching as opposed to set against therapy. Much of our coaching is reparenting. Much of our coaching is paying attention to make sure these lost, and we didn't get into the roles, we can maybe do that later, but like a lost child, we're working with a lost child growing up. When we see that lost child and we're bringing that lost child into the fray, paying attention to him or her, asking probing questions of him and her, that's hugely, hugely healing. A hero child, when the hero child is firmly and kindly told, hey, you've worked your tail off to fill that hole through heroism, being all things to all people. Let's talk about how stressful that has been for you, and for example, and then the rest of the roles too. So there are all kinds of doorways we can go through to address what, Jeff, what your question was. Like, we know the hole is there. We know the bomb is broken. We may know, depending on where you are in the coaching relationship, we may know what you've put in there. So let's grieve how maladaptive, clinical word, how maladaptive the stuff you put in there really was, how destructive it ended up being to you, your wife, your husband, your children. And so I've used that metaphor a ton of the whole, I read that Vol study, maybe 20 years ago or whenever, but I've used that example to say that we is breached, and a child is going to put something in that hole to make themselves okay, which ends up becoming an addictive cycle. Did I clear that up, Jeff? Some?
Yeah, I asked it. Well, that's me. I was asked asking about, but I was thinking that's also Tin Man, like who we work with. It's a great. Thanks.
That story sounded very familiar with you saying it. Anybody else today? Questions? Sorry for the run through and volume.
I'm trying to figure out what my question is, but it centers around. I feel like in these conversations, you can get someone who's denying the grief, and then someone who's drowning in the grief.
Yeah.
And so, it's like, I mean, I'm sure asking questions and where they are is how you deal with that. But I'm just trying to process, uh, you know, how you would deal differently with those two different sides of the coin.
Yeah. It was gallows humor, but my dad, as he was dying, my dad says, yeah, my doctor keeps telling me my heart's in great shape. He goes, so I'm going to die of this thing with a really good heart. And so sometimes we can go through the doors that are open. Like the grief door may not be up. We may know as a coach, like, man, this lady, she is just grieving her tail off and needs to and isn't. But we look for open doors, putting it in our backpack, or as I like to say, putting it in our front pocket, like, hey, I know when I go through these other doors, we're eventually going to get to this room. Grief.
Mhm.
I've phrased it this way. This metaphor may help you. I've said to people, imagine a corridor with doors lining both sides of the hall. And you kick this door open, and you're just mad as you can be. Anger, 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 anger. And this room just got anger all in it. And you kick the next door open, and you're angry, angry, angry. And you kick the next door open, and you're just hurt like crazy. Then you get to this last door, and you kick it open, and you walk in there, and you're just sad. Like we have rooms in our heart where these feelings are located. And I will often say to people also, Matt, for that question that they're kind of in denial of it, like you have a chamber, you have a room to where you and this loss live together.
Mhm.
And we'll get to that room at some point. You may not want to go in the room yet. That's okay. I just want you to know that I'm hiding in my heart this picture of you in this room with this lost vision, hope, dream, person, whatever it is. And I know you've got that in your heart too. And so I just want you to put a pin in that. And one of these days we'll visit that room where your sadness is located. And then for the other that just in the throes of grief, that's when it helps to diffuse the grief energy if they can't seem to get untracked, and bring the other 7 feelings into it. Like to say grief is almost never all by itself. And there are other feelings here too. And then maybe to use an example of one of the most common ones is hurt, because grief interrupts a relationship and it's violent. And so when we have violence perpetrated on us, that's hurt. It hurts. So sometimes it helps to do a little psycho-ed, a little encouragement, some metaphorical work with them to say, hey, I get it. We don't have to be there today. So let's talk about some doors you do know are open. That's very common, that polarity of experience of grief.
I might mention a plug for the intensive for this reason too, Phil, if I can, that watching other people, a group of people have feelings about my story that I don't have is a step toward me having feelings about my own story. And me having feelings about their stories is a step toward me starting to have feelings around my own. Yes. And that is the power of what happens in an intensive. When you send your client to one of these, whether it's the women's or the men's, they come back closer to their story. And with you having a year of work that you can now do with them, like a pile to be taken off of for the next year of your individual work with them, even if you weren't at the intensive. It just, the question is also related to that. And that's, I don't know if I've ever seen anything be more helpful to addressing that, even beyond just me one-on-one with somebody, Phil.
Yes, that's a timely word, Jeff. And it's also true kind of in micro form of a story workshop. Mm-hmm. People experiencing, telling a story and other people being with them. And that's a super great point. Thank you for that.